Santiago saw things differently. Santiago Ramon y Cajal, artist, doctor, father of neuroscience. Written by Christine Iverson, illustrated by Luciano Lozano, and read to you by Miss Gagner, the librarian at Baker School. Santiago is his first name, and he has a long last name, Ramon y Cajal. He was from Spain, and he lived from 1852 to 1934. You can see a map on this page that shows you Spain, the colored in orange country, which is part of Western Europe, and it is just north of Africa and the countries specifically of Morocco and Algeria. He was called the father of neuroscience, and there's a picture at the bottom that shows you what neuroscience is about, which is a scientific study of the nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, nerves, and what it does, its functions, and disorders. The author is American, Christine Iverson, and she studied science and literature in school. The illustrator, Luciano Lozano, was from Spain and he studied illustration. A big theme of this book is STEAM, which is an abbreviation for science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. Specifically, the book emphasizes how arts belong in STEAM, so it isn't just STEM, leaving out the arts. And STEAM or STEM refers to the way of learning where you do creative, hands-on activities with other people. Here's another title page. Santiago saw things differently. Santiago's grandfather had an ancient shop that hung on the craggy edge of the Spanish mountains, and craggy means rough or uneven. Inside were spools of itchy yarn and stone-still looms. Those are machines for making yarn or string into cloth. It was a whispery place where only the dust moved. And you can see his dog there on the bottom. But when Santiago visited the shop, he twirled and tangled the woolen thread around his arms and slid the wooden shuttles across the floor. Dust sparkled and soared in a kaleidoscope of motion. At home in his village, he played marro, which is one Spanish word for the game tag. There's other words from various countries that speak Spanish for tag, like pilla pilla, las traes, mancha, and pinta. As Santiago raced, he jumped and he climbed. He could turn old scraps of metal and wood into music and games. By the time Santiago was 8, he had found a new way to move. Using a piece of chalk or charcoal, he swept lines and curves across doors, gates, and recently painted facades, which are fronts of buildings, and usually people do not like if you draw all over their building. He drew bullfights, sinking ships, and ancient heroes with plumed helmets. To the neighbors, the drawings were a nuisance, which means something annoying. But Santiago saw things differently. He was an artist, and always would be. Santiago's father, the village doctor, thought art was a distraction. Santiago should be learning math, Latin, and strict discipline. But what if Santiago was as talented as the famous painter Velázquez? His father decided to find out. He took Santiago and his best artwork to the village church, where a painter was whitewashing the walls. Santiago showed him his drawings. The painter frowned. He shook his head. But, Santiago's father asked, does the boy really show no aptitude for art? That means skill for art. The painter frowned again. None, my friend. That settled it. To Santiago's father, who knew very little about art, the house painter's judgment was as good as any from a fine arts academy. At home, Santiago's father delivered the final verdict, which means decision. Santiago must study to become a doctor. He confiscated Santiago's paper and charcoal and pencils. No more distractions. But to Santiago, drawing and painting were as natural and necessary as breathing. And his father hadn't found all his art supplies. So Santiago hid what he had left and drew in secret. And you can see his face here, looking up at his father. It doesn't look like he agrees with what his father is doing. I'm also noticing the dog's body language, which looks like he might be a little bit scared, turning away. Once school started, Santiago covered the margins of his school books with drawings. When the teacher wasn't looking, the children passed the drawings around the room until they were caught. As punishment, the teacher locked Santiago in a dark basement room, but forgot to confiscate his pencil and paper. He forgot to take it away. The room was lit by a wisp of light leaking through an old shutter, just enough light for drawing. Santiago stood atop a chair, pressed the paper to the ceiling, and drew for hours. Think how hard that would be, drawing with your hands up in the air like that on the ceiling. When Santiago turned 10, his parents sent him away to a religious school. The friars, his teachers, thought students should sit quietly, memorize, and recite, which means say back to them. But not Santiago. He continued to cover the pages of his schoolbooks with drawings, and when he misbehaved, the friars confined him to the classroom until dinner time, with no paper. So Santiago used his pencil to unlock the door. What a smart kid. When Santiago was 11, his parents chose a different school set against a backdrop of mountains, leafy woodland paths, and a paradise of butterflies and songbirds. As soon as his father's carriage departed, Santiago took the money meant for school supplies and bought his first paint box. He brought his paint box on hikes where he mixed green with blue to create olive trees, black with green to make cypress trees, yellow with green to make boxwood, and brown with black to make a cabin's frame. In his heart, he would always be an artist, but his father still wanted him to become a doctor. One summer night, just before he turned 16, Santiago and his father slipped over a moonlit wall into an abandoned graveyard to find bits and pieces of skeletons. They examined every detail of the bones. When Santiago fit the pieces together like a puzzle, he felt a special delight, these are his words, in taking apart and putting together again, piece by piece, the organic clock. To Santiago's father, bones were a basic introduction to anatomy, which is the study of human or animal bodies. But Santiago saw things differently. He saw the human body as a work of art. Look at that dog even has one of the bones in his mouth. He wanted to know more. At 18, he went to school in Saragossa, that's in Spain, to study medicine. With lessons about the roots of arteries and the course of blood flow fresh in his mind, he explored the Ebro River. He scrambled over rocks to follow it sliding through the mountains, curving around the cathedral, and finally flowing under a stone bridge. And that's still Santiago down there in the jacket and pants with the hat on. He's just older now. After graduation, he had to trade hikes in the mountains for duty in Cuba with the Spanish army. In Cuba, there were tropical forests, dangling vines, and swaying palm trees to explore. There was also malaria, which is a dangerous disease. Santiago returned home too sick and weak to hike. Instead, he used the last of his army pay to buy a microscope for studying anatomy. When he peered through the lens, he discovered a world rich with uncharted lands. He picked up his pencil and began to draw. Santiago drew and studied and tutored until he became a professor of anatomy in Valencia, also in Spain. In Valencia, Santiago learned about a problem. Other scientists couldn't understand exactly how people's brains worked. They knew nerve fibers, tiny, stringy structures, were involved, but nerve fibers were hard to see, even under a microscope. Some scientists tried to help by coloring the fibers with a stain, but the stain worked only on a few of the fibers. As for the rest of the fibers, they looked like a tangled forest, where the branches, vines, and thickets seemed interconnected in a never-ending web. But Santiago saw things differently. When Santiago looked through his microscope at the smallest and youngest of the fibers, he saw seeds, seedlings, and saplings. He drew pictures of the fibers at different stages of growth until his pencil began to unlock patterns. He found that young fibers grew into trees with trunks, branches, and leaves. The branches looked tangled, but did they really fuse together like the other scientists thought? And on this page, you notice that a lot of these words are usually used to describe plants, but now they're describing part of a person's body. Santiago knew he would have to change the stain to see the branches more clearly. He experimented with different chemicals until he found just the right mixture. What he saw next took his breath away. That means he was amazed. The full-grown trees never fused together. They never blended. They only reached out toward one another. The forest wasn't a tangled web. It was made up of individual trees. Once Santiago could see entire trees, and again, we're not talking about trees in a forest, but things that look like trees that are in your body, He understood that he was looking at nerve cells separated by gaps, spaces. The more he drew, the more patterns he discovered. He also found that nerve cells, almost as if following an unspoken rule, were arranged in one direction, like arrows pointing the way on a path. And by looking even closer, Santiago determined that nerve cells used the path to transmit messages, one nerve cell to the next. The nervous system was full of beautifully organized pathways for thinking, reacting, learning, and moving. Santiago made thousands of scientific drawings, each one an intricate work of art. He sent his drawings all over the world and challenged other scientists until they could see too. His work enabled scientists and doctors to find new ways to help people learn and heal. Santiago changed the way scientists understood the nervous system because he saw things differently, brilliantly. With the eyes of an artist, he had found what he called the mysterious butterflies of the soul, those tiny nerve cells that allow us to be a part of the world. Santiago Ramon y Cajal became the father of neuroscience. And here at the end, it gives us a little bit more information about neurons and the life of Santiago. And on the left, there's a note that says each year 6 Nobel Prizes are awarded to people anywhere in the world for, quote, the greatest benefit to humankind. And Santiago won the Nobel Prize for Science and Medicine in 1906. And what's kind of interesting is the person that he won it with, and it says this at the bottom of the page, spent his whole time accepting the speech, his acceptance speech, accepting the award, saying why Santiago was wrong, which is kind of interesting. And here's more. Keeps going on about Santiago's life and gives you some references where you can learn more. And a lot of nonfiction books will do that. They'll give you information at the back of the book where you can learn more about the subject. And there's the end. The sources are listed on this page, and you can find out more about any of these topics by going to these sources.